event, Mark Count, 10 rounds, from the Bronx, New York. He's wearing black trunks. He weighs 160 pounds even. Joey Archer. His opponent from Sydney, Nova Scotia. He's wearing white trunks. He weighs 158.25 pounds. Recognized as the Canadian middleweight champion, Blair Richardson. Main event, 10 rounds, another bout to follow.
Man is against his own nature. He doesn't know anything about it until he tries boxing. He'll find out about his endurance, he'll find out about his heartbeat, and what he has to do to keep that on the level to compete. You're testing who you really are mentally, you know, because it's very easy when the body starts to get tired. If you're not mentally right, you'll quit. But that's when you'll find out what you're lacking.
At one time down here in Cape Breton Island, there were 8 Canadian champions.
Cape Breton during that time period was a very industrial place. The coal mines were all still booming, the steel plant was still employing hundreds into the thousands of workers. All work that involved being strong, being healthy, lent itself to a sport that had a lot to do with vigorous conditioning, training. You can't have the interest in the sport unless you have a trainer, someone that's going to teach people some of the skills. So there was a gentleman from the States, and his name was Joe Giovanni, an Italian man, and Giovanni came here and he lived here. He lived in the pier. He had a boxing ring set up above one of the stores, the grocery stores. So we're talking 1910s. Giovanni was training any number of young guys. He trained guys like Johnny Nemis from New Waterford, who became a really, really popular boxer. He fought over 250 fights. But Nemis then became a trainer himself.
Well, Johnny was a top boxer himself, like in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And he was a tremendous trainer. He had his own way, his own style. The only fault I would find with Johnny Nemis was like he wanted to do everything himself. And it was kind of difficult to do that. You couldn't suggest anything, but as far as the trainer is concerned, he was equally as good as any of them.
He started out a lot of younger boxers. Blair Richardson, who was British Empire middleweight champion, would have been training with Nemis originally, and then he would move on to John Cechetto.
All great fighters, Canadian-wise, he had them there. He had like Bonaparte Bobo, he had B. Arsenal there, he had Tyrone Gardiner.
John Cechetto, he would go to see a fighter fight in Glasgow next week that I'd be fighting a month later. And he would go, and then he'd come back and we'd change our style to meet what we were going to meet. If you haven't got faith in the trainer, you're wasting your time in there.
The Venetian Gardens was a really interesting venue. It was a dance hall down on the Esplanade in Sydney.
There was 3 floors, and in the basement, the first floor, was where there was a beautiful gym put in there, and a lot of good fighters trained there. I
used to make a joke about the place. Like a day done, I said, a young fella come in, he'd drop his towel. I said, leave it there. The floor was that dirty. Don't use it.
Cechetto was the trainer down there. That was the hot spot. So, and then when matches were put on, they were put on in there as well. And they would be packed with hundreds and hundreds of people.
They'd pick sometimes out of the crowd a fighter to fight you, and that was touchy. They'd say we're short a fighter, and he should weigh around 135 pounds, and there'd be lots of fellas wanting to get in there. Everybody knows that Rudy Plichie is the best cut man in the country.
I grew up in the mining district, Table Head. I started out there in the coal mine. Matter of fact, that was my living in the coal mines. I couldn't miss getting involved in boxing because I used to walk to work with a guy that was ranked in the world one time in the 20s and 30s, Stevie Kid MacDonald. Locally, I got involved with Johnny Cechetto. And I did coal mining, trained 5 Canadian champions. I even booked them, and that was like Johnny Devison, he was bantamweight champion of Canada. Rudy MacDougall, he was featherweight champion of Canada. Tyrone Gardiner was lightweight champion of Canada.
A cutman is a gentleman that works in your corner with your manager, trainer. He, when you get cut and you're bleeding, you gotta have a good cutman, not some fellas that'll throw some Vaseline on it.
I get a hold of the doctor and I'll show him the kit, what I'm using. And I will not work on the outside of the ropes. I'm on the inside. And why I'm working on the inside is like, for number one, is your eyes. Your eyes tells a lot of stories. The pupils get small or large, there's an indication. There's a head injury, you're getting hurt hard. And I want to be in there on the breathing mechanism. When you're breathing deep, if you can't breathe deep, you could have a cracked rib. The bell rings in the opposite corner. It takes about 4 or 5 seconds to get there. You haven't got much time to work. So you have to be working all the time. And you have to know you can't be opening balls up or looking for anything. You got to know where everything is at to be successful. If not, you're going to have an awful problem.
Without the promoters, you had nothing.
The promoter has to be a matchmaker. He has to bring in the right fights to market it. And number one, he cannot, in order to develop the local guy, he can't overmatch him. So this is where his importance comes in.
Well, Gussie MacLellan was the biggest and the finest.
Gussie done in all categories of boxing. He was a boxer, he was featherweight, maritime featherweight champion in the 30s. He moved away to Boston. He boxed in New England for several years. He come back to Cape Breton and he started promoting.
Gussie knew how to promote. He could charm anybody, you know.
The little man with the big cigar.
With the big cigar is right.
Gussie was the rock in the boxing world here. He promoted guys like George Rockabye Ross, Tommy Gunn Spencer, Joe Pyle, Gordon Kiley. The list goes on and on. He said to me, the greatest thing can happen to an athlete is to become a champion in the country that he was born in. And the big plus, he said, the greatest country on earth, Canada. He always felt that the guy to become a champion in the country was a big thing. He made sure the local guy gave him all the opportunity in the world to fight for a Canadian title.
George Rockabye Ross from West Bay. A country boy, I called him, because he was a real country boy and a gentleman.
There's nobody could bring people into an arena like Rockabye Ross. Nobody.
I trained with George at the Venetian Gardens when I was down there, and George used to come in, and he was a strong, strong individual.
He was very popular as a Gold Glove champion. He was an outstanding fighter in the Army, and he went on to be the middleweight champion of Canada.
He would be a fighter that would stand toe-to-toe with anybody, and he'd come out the winner.
His nickname Rockabye was because he would just rock, Rockabye baby, that kind of a thing. He'd just knock you out and you'd be finished. Most of his fights he won by knockouts. So he fought in the 40s. He worked with the promoter, Gussie MacLellan. He could set fights up with almost anybody. Any big name fighter Ross could get to fight. Ross actually went to England.
But he was handicapped by cuts. He had bad tissue for cuts, you know.
He didn't pull off the wins that he needed in England. That was really due to, because Ross had a problem with bleeding eyebrows. And he fought so much, like almost once every 3 weeks. He didn't have time to heal properly. If that hadn't happened to him, he may have won some of these matches, and then he may have been in contention to fight some of the best middleweights there ever were.
He had what I call it. He drew regardless, win, lose, or draw. He put in 4,000 people in Glace Bay Farm there, and 5,000 people every fight. When he was finished from boxing, when he went to Australia, he made a comeback. He fought 10 rounders, and he packed the houses over there. There was no shortcuts for Tyrone Gardiner in boxing.
Tyrone went in the ring, he went in there to fight. And he threw a lot of punches.
I worked with a lot of fighters. He's very exciting. All these fights, win, lose, or draw, he came to fight.
I enjoyed was walk across the ring and go right head to head. That's what I enjoyed. Not dance around and fool around, and you had some fighters, the only time they'd fight is when they could get in range with you, that they could jump into you.
He started out as Cape Breton lightweight champion. He went on to be the Nova Scotia lightweight champion. He went on to be the Eastern Canadian champion, and he finally hit his goal to get there to become the lightweight champion of Canada, which he retired undefeated as.
I was very young, I'd say 12, 13 years old, when I used to come across the front of the 1060 Union Hall. And I'd look in the windows as a young boy and watch the boys training there and what have you. One day, the trainer, who was the head trainer at the 1064 Union Hall, he said, "Young fella," he said, "why don't you come in the gym and help the boys?" So I went in and I used to take water to them and what have you. One thing led to another, and the first thing you know, they had me sparring. Then I went down to the Venetian Gardens, and I went under the training of the late Johnny Cechetto.
Gardiner was about the strongest lightweight at 135 pounds I ever worked with. Natural strength.
As is known by my record, I could knock people out very easily. John Cechetto was in Ontario, and he had a fighter up there fighting, and the Fredin the Bull was the main event, fighting an American fighter. And John watched him, and when John got home, the promoters were all interested in me fighting the Bull. "Oh, John," he said, "we better take our time on this. That bull can punch. And if the two of you go head to head, I don't know who'd come out on top." The bull would knock almost everybody out with his power. He was strong and what have you. So we were training, and at the time, Johnny said to me many times, he said, "Tyrone, we're not going to stand toe-to-toe with him. Now, we're going to outbox him. He's going to have to miss and move around the ring and be out of hitting range and what have you." Well, the fight started. That's what I intended to do, was keep moving and what have you. But in my style, I like to mix it up. And I walked in and went toe-to-toe with him. And Mr. Man, I'll tell you, he was hitting me on the shoulder and my ribs were sore. He could really punch. He was an uppercut and a hook. We call the left hook. He could knock you down with no trouble at all. So the fight was a very rough fight. And, but anyway, we came out on top. I had so many people that helped me that I wouldn't have time enough today to tell you the names and what have you.
Blair Richardson was born at Soap Bar, Nova Scotia, about 2 miles from Sydney. And Blair Bertrand became the British Commonwealth middleweight champion.
As a boxer, he was one of the smartest I've seen. Clean-cut boxer that he could box with anybody in the world.
He was just determined. That he was going to make it, no matter what. Blair was a smart, very smart young man.
He came in with John Cechetto at the Venetian Gardens in the gym when John Cechetto was running it.
He had the punching power of a much heavier fighter. He
was a puncher, but he didn't depend on that. He outboxed He was a beautiful left hand. He had that in your face all night. He'd win each round by round.
His left hand was dynamite. He could change a jab into a hook to an uppercut so fast it was just like crease lightning.
He was a Golden Glove champion. He went on to be the Nova Scotia champion. He was Maritime champion, and he was actually Eastern Canadian champion. Then he was middleweight champion, and then he fought for the British Commonwealth title, and he won the British Commonwealth title from Gomie O'Brennan.
To win a Commonwealth prize is like, you know, being a champion of half the world.
Blair Richardson was the only Nova Scotian I've known of ever fought a main event at Madison Square Garden. He fought 10 rounds. He fought the on-crown middleweight champion of the world at the time, Joey Archer. As a matter of fact, I brought that film in, and I got copies of it. And I gave it to different fellows to watch that. And I think if that fight had been in Nova Scotia, it would have been different results.
The reason he didn't ever fight for a world championship was just they just couldn't get it arranged.
Gussie went very close to bring them together in Toronto with the European champion, Nino Benvenuti. But it fell through. Whatever happened, I couldn't tell you. But Gussie was very interested in that fight.
Blair and her father they never wore their religion on their arm or anything like that, but they practiced it.
He's from Sydney, but he was back and forth to Boston. He was going to university there. He was studying theology.
He completed what he wanted to do in boxing, but now his goal was to preach. Boy, he loved working with youth in Boston. He was also did a radio program, Christian youth program there, and he had quite a following there.
Blair died just before he was 31 they believe it was an aneurysm or a brain tumor.
They operated right away, and but the operation wasn't what they had hoped, I guess. But he's supposed to come come out of the anesthetic the next morning. And he looked, he says, there's a lot of people here for organs. He says, my eyes are great, my heart is great, my kidneys are great, my liver is great. Whatever you need, he says, I want you to take them, give them to people who need them. He said, the fight is over for me. I
know people that are, a few years older than me remember hearing about the death of Blair Richardson, and they, around here it was like, where were you when JFK died? It was kind of like it was a total shock to people. No one ever expected that could ever happen to him.
After I retired and John Cechetto gave up promoting and Gussie MacLellan was out of the picture, the fight game dropped off.
It almost died when Blair died.
The Venetian Gardens burnt in the 60s. When it was rebuilt, it never got it back to what it was.
When Gussie passed on, I think pro boxing died with him. I don't think he'll ever be duplicated.
Boxing's never really died out here. There are clubs still around Cape Breton to today, but the glory days of it all, the heyday, when you'd have thousands of fans out, that was in, 50s into the 60s.
Backing of fans, unreal. When the fight would go on, there'd be jobs that fellas wouldn't be going to work.
By the time Saturday rolled around, fight night, like Spade Jesus, they were hanging off of the rafters.
The paper would announce on Monday, Tyrone's going to fight in New Glasgow 2 weeks' time. The next night, the gym would be packed with fellas that would want to help me in the ring. I'd have no trouble getting sparring partners for 10, 12, 14 rounds. So those things were so important to me.
All these Cape Breton boxers, they all had one thing in common: intestinal fortitude. Ask them to fight is always when and where. And that was the only questions they ever asked.